We concluded the last lecture with a discussion of atmospheric perspective and spoke about how, using color, we can create the illusion of spatial depth. We'll continue here with a discussion of how we make objects appear three-dimensional. If we draw a block with all planes identical in color, we get relative flatness. But make a differentiation in color, here in value, and we'll get dimension. We can create volume in any palette and in any range of values. We could increase the contrast, or lighten the range, or darken it. And we could shift into any hue, green or yellow or red, or we can move more neutral to the warm, or neutral to the cool. Each time we've used one color and changed its value. But we could accompany the change in value with a change in saturation, more saturated in the light, less as we move away. We could do this in the cool range and in the warm, and we could also modulate hue in this progression, here using complements, orange and blue, progressively cooler as we move away from the light. Or we could use adjacent color, here yellow, green, blue, here accompanied by diminishing saturation. Cezanne modulates his pairs from yellow through green and into a darker, less saturated green. And the ground's less saturated with less internal value contrast than the pairs. In Bigland's skin, we move from a light warm to a darker, less saturated warm to darks that are in places much cooler. Like the Cezanne, the two ground shapes have much less contrast than the figure. The Vermeer, like the Aikens, is naturalistic. The modulation of the woman's skin is similar to Bigland's, light and warm to darker and a bit cooler to darker and cooler still. And the ground contains much less contrast than the figure. Each artist uses a specific palette to create a mood and quality of light. Each uses relative contrast of hue, value, and saturation to create a visual hierarchy with focal points. And within the given palette and hierarchy, each artist creates the illusion of space, volume, and light. So, a reasonable procedure to follow is to ask, what's the intended mood or flavor? Remember the photos we looked at in the last lecture. Grass isn't always green, nor is the sky blue. Make a determination about mood and palette first, let everything else follow. If you're working from observation, use the same principles. That means carefully considering the color and value of all the elements in a still life as you set up, down to the wall, table, and lighting. When working from a landscape, it means organizing the color you see and interpreting it in a way that serves the mood of the drawing. And there are good reasons for leaning on reality even when you want a naturalistic result. Artists do this all the time. It should be clear that even very representational artists don't copy what's before them. In our discussion of value, we noted that focusing on an object rewards it with high value contrast and clear definition of edge. With color, we'll perceive greater saturation in the object or area receiving the eye's focus. And this is the visual principle Vermeer uses in his treatment of the woman's head in relation to the painting behind her. He paints the painting as if he's seeing it peripherally. Our consideration of color started with what would be termed color theory. We spoke about color abstractly. We talked about blue and red and said that mixing the two makes violet. But when we use pigments like pastel, we have many blues and reds to choose from, each a different color, and not all blues and reds make violet. So I'd suggest making tests to see how your pigments actually behave. Here's one way. Make swatches of your colors running in horizontal rows across your page. I've made 4 rows of 14 colors with space below the second, third, and fourth row. I've used a yellow, a center green, a center blue, a blue violet, a red violet, a center red, a center orange, a yellow earth, an orange earth, a red earth, a dark brown, a black, a gray, and a white. Select one pastel, I'll use yellow, and mix it with all the colors in all 4 rows. After each one, wipe the pastel to keep it clean. The first row I'll leave as is. The second I'll blend with a cotton swab. Then use the material on the swab to create a new swatch in the space. In the next row, I'll add yellow's complement, violet, and again mix and sample with the swab. In the final row, I'll add a neutral gray. And once again, mix and sample to create new swatches. Having done this, you'll likely think of variations of this test. For instance, you could try applying a color, spraying it with workable fixative, and then applying another color on top semi-transparently. It's pretty endless. There's an amazing amount you'll learn by putting each stick through its paces. In these color lectures, I've outlined different palettes, analogous, complementary, etc. Working with a palette means making a selection of pastels to use for a given drawing. The goal is to limit the number of colors while maintaining a range from light to dark and saturated to neutral. This yields both cohesion and the opportunity for abundant contrast. For instance, for an orange-blue complementary drawing, I might select a cool blue, a warm blue, a saturated orange, an earth orange like a raw sienna, a dark neutral brown, a gray and a white. For a red-green system, I could select a cool green, a warm green, a saturated red, an earth red like a burnt sienna, and the dark brown, gray, and white. And for a yellow-violet, a blue-violet, a red-violet, a saturated yellow, an earth yellow like a yellow ochre, and the brown, gray, and white. In each case, you have a warm and cool version of your cool, a saturated and earth version of your warm, a dark, and two neutrals. This gives you the opportunity to mix a great range of color. Some might add a light and dark version of each color for greater value contrast. For analogous palettes, you could follow the same model. For instance, for a yellow-green palette, I could select a saturated yellow, an earth yellow like a yellow ochre, a cool green, a warm green, and the brown, gray, and white. As a variant, I could leave out the cool green and the resulting drawing would feel warmer. It's a great idea to create test sheets to play through the relationships of the sticks you'd use in a given palette before making a drawing. This will give you options when you approach the drawing. Now, I'd like you to do a series of drawings to explore color palettes, control hierarchy, and create space, volume, and light. So you can really concentrate on this, and it's plenty. I'd like you to compose very simply. Take a rectangle and divide it along a horizontal, yielding a tabletop and a wall. Then imagine a block, sphere, cylinder, cone, or other solid lit by a single light source. Then think mood and palette. Employ value and color hierarchically so that the object is the focal point, and use color within the given palette to create the illusion of volume, space, and light. Think in 4 to 9 steps of light as you move across the large planes of the table and wall and the object itself. I'd suggest using colored paper. The great thing about colored paper is that it immediately asserts color and mood. It also provides an underlying unifying hue for the drawing. You can use this to help create smooth transitions where you want them because you have a shared underlying color. Where you don't, work opaquely so that the paper is less visible. A pack of mixed sheets of colored construction paper or a pad of colored pastel paper will work well. It's difficult to handle the pastel at a small scale, so I'd recommend paper that's at least medium size. Common measures are 11 by 14, 12 by 16, and 12 by 18. Casson Mitant makes a selection of papers in larger 19 by 25-inch sheets. I'll outline 10 palettes to start with and illustrate most with student examples. Number 1, a light, warm paper with analogous color, here yellow. To begin a drawing like this, it makes sense to start linearly with a light yellow. Number 2, a lighter warm paper with complementary color. That could be yellow-violet, orange-blue, or red-green. Number 3, a lighter cool paper with analogous color. Here, blue to violet pink. For the complementary and analogous drawings, use the palettes I just outlined to help you choose your pastels. Number 4, a light, cool paper with complementary color. Here, orange-blue. Note how the pastels use transparently in the tabletop and walls so we get optical mixing. The oranges in the wall become much more neutral than in the saturated front plane where it's applied opaquely. Number 5, a darker warm paper with analogous color. Here, red to orange and yellow. 6, a darker warm paper with complementary color. Here, a red-green on a neutral red earth tone paper. For a red-green complement, you could use a central red, burnt sienna, 2 greens, a dark brown, and a white. 7, a darker cool paper with analogous color. Here, blue to green. 8, a darker cool paper with complementary color, like orange on a dark blue ground. This uses 1 orange, 1 blue, and white, and the blue of the paper itself. Number 9, a neutral earth paper with analogous color. And number 10, a neutral earth paper with complementary color. Here, yellow-violet, starting on a neutral yellow earth ground. It's actually a piece of cardboard. Over time, work your way through all the primaries and secondaries in both their analogous and complementary palettes. Once you've covered the bases, extend out and make further experiments. Start with a yellow monochromatic palette and extend into a darker red like a burnt sienna. A small change, but a very different feel from the straight-up yellow monochrome. Or take an orange-blue and extend into yellow for the lightest tones, combining the idea of an analogous palette with a complementary one. Or straddling certain terrain. Here we're starting with an earth tone ground. It has both an orange and a red character. Overall, the palette has aspects of an analogous red-violet-blue, but also feels a bit like an orange-blue complement. There are endless variations to be played with here. Monet loved these kinds of experiments. He repeated the same painting or drawing over and over again, but varied the light, mood, and palette. Look up his haystacks, the Waterloo Bridge, the Houses of Parliament. There are multiple versions of each that explore color and light. And of course, there's a Rouen Cathedral. Here, pretty much a split complement, yellow to blue-violet-red. The facade and sky are pretty cool and shady. Here, in full sunshine, with a more or less orange-blue complement. We can take any palette, monochrome, analogous, complementary, or earth tone, and make it light, mid-tone, or dark. Similarly, we can make any of these highly saturated, mid-saturation, or very neutral. So the number of potential palettes is nearly inexhaustible. Once you've made these first color studies, try creating a still life from your imagination. Start by making small, monochromatic gestural sketches in pen or pencil to find a composition. Then take a look at the single object color studies to get ideas about possible palettes to apply to the still life. Then do a small color study. It needn't be highly articulated or detailed. It can consist of smudges of color that relate to the shapes in the composition. Shouldn't take more than a couple of minutes. And you might want to try a couple variations. Then line up your color variations and take a couple steps back. You're trying to judge the overall color and mood. Choose the one that you think works best. Depending on the complexity of the drawing, you may want to get larger, better quality paper for this and the following projects, like those 19 by 25 canson mitins. To make the drawing, use the same principles you use to draw the geometric solids. Here are some student examples. One in an analogous palette, another complementary. You'll note how the darkness of the paper sets up the mood of the drawing. The utility of working from your imagination is that you can't copy details. You have to think abstractly about the large color relationships. The goal is to select a range or palette of color and value to create a mood. Use that palette to create a hierarchical structure that creates focal areas and focal points. And within the hierarchical structure, create the illusion of volume, space, and light. There are a number of key points from earlier lectures that you want to be sure to consider. First, make sure you're thinking compositionally. Be attentive to the format shape and its large divisions, those positive and negative shapes. Build your objects using shapes and geometric solids. Be aware of the eye height and the horizon. This will indicate how much of any plane you'll be able to see. Work from the large decisions to the small. Detail comes last. Make sure your paper's color relates to the color system you're working with. This is an excellent example. The neutral tone works as a base for the overall color mood of the drawing. It's useful to start fairly neutral and monochrome. This lets you attend to proportion and placement first. Once these issues have been attended to, add analogous or complementary colors, working up from lower to higher saturations. Follow this with a still life drawn from observation, but take the same care with palette. Be prepared to drape a wall or table and be choosy with your objects and type and direction of light. Think how everything relates in terms of mood, hierarchy, space, and volume. If you don't have enough colored objects on hand, go to a local thrift store and pick up an assortment of objects that can complete different color palettes. Then try an interior. This is a pastel by Norman Lundin, very much in the neutral range, naturalistic and, at the same time, abstract. 4 large interlocking shapes. The floor and ceiling of a similar mid-dark value sandwich with the light, warmer walls in between. The highlighted edge of the central wall and its reflections in the ceiling and floor become the focal area. The very light highlight near the floor, the focal point. The Lundin is in one sense typical of many naturalistic works in that it depends on very neutral color. It looks nothing like the primaries and secondaries in the color wheel. We begin to get neutral color like we find in the Lundin at the very inner and outer rings of a more complex wheel that gets into the tints and shades of a given hue. But even here, the color is more saturated than what we find in Lundin's interior. That's because most of the colors of things we routinely see have no common name. We could say that in the beginning there was yellow, red, and blue, and they begat orange, green, and violet. And in the next generation they begat yellow, orange, orange, red, red, violet, etc. But the colors we're talking about now, these very neutral colors, though they're related to these early progenitors, they occur many generations later. Van Gogh, quite aware of this fact, wrote in an 1885 letter, quote, "How typical that saying is about the figures of Millet. Son paysan semble peint avec la terre qu'il ensemence. His peasant looks like he was painted with the earth he's sowing." How exact and how true, and how important it is to know how to mix on the palette those colors which have no name and yet are the real foundation of everything, unquote. A common problem people have when starting out with color is that they conceive of it in terms of nameable color, primaries, secondaries, and the like. They're all useful, but a command of all the grays and seeing the grays as color is all but essential. Similarly, many beginners see a white bowl or a black hat and immediately grab the white or the black pastel and start filling in that section of their drawing. But the white bowl's rarely white and the black hat's rarely black. When we look at a nominally white or off-white wall, we're actually seeing a whole range of color. The walls in this photo are all painted the same color, a warm off-white. But because of context, they appear as different hues and saturations. The primary light source is out of the frame. It's a window below, on the left wall. So that wall is darker, partly silhouetted. The ceiling and right wall receive light directly from the window and are predictably lighter. But the walls are affecting one another. Can you see how the dark of the left wall's reflected into the corner of the ceiling and right wall? As we move away from this dark reflection, we get lighter where the maximum light from the window reaches both surfaces. As we move far to the right, the strength of the window's light diminishes and the two surfaces get progressively darker. We also see the effects of simultaneous contrast on the left wall. Looks darker against the two light walls than in its interior, and the interior is receiving reflected light from both the lighter parts of the ceiling and right wall. As to color, it's all very neutral. Here are 6 swatches sampled from the walls. The left column is from the left wall, the center column from the ceiling, the right column from the right wall. The top row samples are taken from the central corner where the 3 walls meet. The bottom row from the lightest part of each surface's interior. The left's column's darker than the center and right. That's expected. The left wall's in partial silhouette. And the top row's darker than the bottom. That's expected too. That represents the corner versus the lightest part of each wall. So those are the value relationships. But can you see these as colors, as related to hues, to reds, oranges, blues, and violets? That's the goal. As Van Gogh says, they're the real foundation of everything. We'll look at the bottom row first. The ceiling and right wall are not only lighter, but much cooler than the left wall. Their hues are neutrals more toward the blue-violet. The lightest part of the left wall lists warmer, more towards the orange. Why? Well, the ceiling and right wall receive daylight from the window, and daylight, if there's no direct sun, is cool in color. And the lightest part of the left wall is warmer than the lightest part of the ceiling or right wall, but it looks cool compared to the left wall's corner, so all this is relative. Let's look at the top row. Overall, warmer than the bottom row. Why are the ceiling and right wall warmer in the corner? They're getting the reflection of the left wall. And why are they still cooler than the left wall? They're still getting more daylight than the left. Color is mixing on the surfaces. The color of the lights mixing with the reflected color of the warm wall. Just as with value, light is the reason we see any color at all. The color that anything or any part of a thing appears to be is directly related to the color and strength of the light source, and it's also tied up with the way in which surfaces share color through reflection. When we look at any given area, we're often seeing the accumulation of multiple factors creating the instance of color. Often the distances are small. The gray is just slightly warmer, or cooler, or darker, or lighter, or more to the yellow, away from the red. You've already seen how we can use our complements, earth tones, and neutrals to create these chromatic grays. And the more you look analytically, the more you learn to see small differences in walls and ceilings, and in art too. This is just what we find in the Canaletto. The shifts of hue and value in the tall tower consists of taking a neutral a bit this way, then that. Same in the David. While many people are drawn to the drama of the figure, these subtle changes of value in chroma and the architecture create a compelling underlying drama if you know what to look for. In the light tones, and in the mid-range, and in the darks. There's a good exercise that can help you analyze unnameable color. The project involves drawing a still life of white objects on a white table in front of a white wall. A variant is to draw a white toilet on a white tile floor in front of a white wall. In both cases, you'll find that almost nothing's white. Just like the white walls we looked at earlier, there's a lot of color, color reflection, and interaction. This is a kind of drawing that can be done in several different palettes. If you do this with an incandescent light source, an orange-blue complementary system and related neutrals can be a good place to start. Another common problem students experience is to feel that they're not getting as wide a range of color as they'd like in a drawing, so they wind up using every pigment in their kit. Often a better approach is to try to find more color within the palette's restrictions. Remember, color's relative. By changing in a budding color, you can make an existing color feel lighter or darker, or more neutral or more saturated, or warmer or cooler. Here, greener or bluer. And it's often not a new nameable color we need. For example, you're in a red-green complementary system and you feel your red is not projecting enough. So you want to add a new stick, maybe some violet or yellow to accentuate the central red object. But keep Van Gogh's words in mind. How important it is to know how to mix those colors which have no name. So instead you modify the ground, you pull it into a slightly greener neutral, and the red projects in a much more dominant way. Now, there's no rule here, but since most people err on the side of too many random colors, this may help you discover some less obvious solutions and avoid some common pitfalls. Another great project is a portrait or self-portrait. But bring all the thinking you used in setting up your still life to bear here. There's a passage in E.L. Doctorow's novel City of God. He writes, "After the set is lit, the camera is positioned, the actors have taken their place, costumed, their hair dressed to indicate economic class, education, age, social status, virtue, or the lack of it, 95% of the meaning of the scene is established before anyone says a word." It's actually very good advice to anyone using a model. The environment, the lighting, point of view, costume, and of course palette all combine to create mood and meaning. Remember, every surface can be affected by reflected color, flesh included. In the veneer, note how the color of the jacket reflects up into the shadow side of the woman's arm, and the orange skirt reflects up into the fur trim. So compose your setup with all this in mind. And if you belong to a life drawing group, bring your pastels and apply specific palettes in your drawings. Here we have an analogous orange, yellow, green on a neutral pink ground. High saturations are saved for the figure, and we get high value contrast between the figure and the dramatic cast shadow. The green of the wall is applied transparently and mixes optically with the neutral pink paper to create neutral green grays. Then take a cue from Monet and go outside. Draw at different times of day under different weather conditions. A sunny day or a gloomy overcast day each present a palette, a defined range of color with a specific emotional thrust. After drawing several landscapes from observation, bring your drawings inside. Use these drawings, as well as your knowledge about composition, space, and color, to construct a second landscape from your imagination. We've noted environmental factors that influence color. Using two different color and light environments in the same drawing can be an interesting project. One classic way to approach this project is to use an interior with a view out a window. Less common, though no less interesting, is to look from the outside in. Another great exercise is to adopt a palette from a drawing, painting, film still, or other source that piques your interest. You can eyeball the color and make some swatches with your pastels. You could also use digital sampling to distill a palette. Congratulations! This lecture concludes our study of the major formal elements of drawing. A good deal of the art in drawing has to do with how you balance all these pieces. Central to doing this well is having a sense about what you're trying to bring out, like a composer orchestrating a piece of music or a director editing a movie scene. A well-executed drawing at an abstract level controls the way the viewer moves through it. In this sense, all drawings are abstract, and it's through these relationships that meaning, broadly defined, emerges. I've chosen 3 drawings to review some major considerations in this regard. The first is the Degas, a quick scribble done on a sleepy night in a brothel. While quick and gestural, every mark and smudge is made in reference to the geometry of the format shape. The woman and the man ride one diagonal. As a counterbalance, the table straddles the diagonal of the format's central horizontal quarters, creating 2 mirrored wedge shapes, top and bottom. Though there's not a lot of shading, we get an impressive sensation of depth. There are 3 depths of space. The woman, table, and bottle occupy the foreground. They clearly overlap the man in the midground. The background is signaled by the diagonal line behind the man. That indicates a visual event, perhaps furniture or molding, seen periphery on a wall behind him. The use of diminishing value, line weights, and level of detail all work to create the illusion of a depth of space. We also experience volume, primarily through cross-contour. Many of the internal marks in the figures, while describing drapery or a part of the body, are really creating volume. Note the strap over the woman's shoulder, and the many marks tracing over her back, and the internal line on the man's shoulder. This line gives us 2 planes, top of shoulder and front of chest. The highest value contrast is associated with the woman's head, focal point. Her body's next, that's the greater focal area. Here's Chagoué's Mountain Market Clear with Rising Mist. The format's divided at the horizontal half with stresses at the horizontal quarters. There are stresses at the vertical half and quarters too. We get space and atmosphere through a deft manipulation of line, mark, and value. The closer marks are more pronounced, tightly spaced and darker. As we recede in space, value and detail are subsumed by the atmosphere. Last, the Eakins watercolor. Every piece is tied to the geometry of the format, to the horizontal half, vertical half, horizontal quarter, and the diagonals. The ground, without Biglin, his skull, and the reflection, is like a whisper. All the light-dark contrast, the contrast of saturation, are reserved for the main subject in relation to the ground. All the strong directions, the important diagonals, are similarly reserved for Bigland. He's the solid, weighty thing against all the water and atmosphere. His head and torso are the focal point, with the skull the focal area. As you work through the projects using color, ask yourself what you're trying to bring out, and keep all these elements of formal language in mind. They'll help you get there.